of the field for in a variety of roles, including as a former trial attorney, and also working on with Farella, Braun, and Martel's environmental law department. So
there's no chair.
Moving forward, I'd like to hand it over to.
Make sure that they're recording it.
I'm sorry, we have a speaker who needs to mute themselves, please. If you're on, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. All right. So with that, I think we have a couple of polling questions that we'd like to offer to the audience, just to get a sense of who you are. So very quickly, we'd like to know, what sector do you work in, please? So you should be seeing the poll, and go ahead and just respond. This really helps our speakers understand who's on the line. Great. So as the numbers come in, we're seeing 45% of you are with local or state government, 35% are in the private sector. We also have some federal government and nonprofit folks with us. Thank you so much. Second poll question. Sorry, we're moving on here. How many years have you been in the land reuse field? You should be seeing this. Okay, so the numbers are coming in. All right, so we have about a quarter of you have been in for 20 or more years, and we have a good chunk. Actually, we're pretty evenly distributed, so it looks like from 0 to 20 and more years, we've been working in the field. All right, moving forward. Our next poll question for you.
Ooh, no. I don't know what's going on there.
I'm sorry, we're having some, no. All right. We want to know, what is your relationship to environmentally impaired properties? Again, this really helps our speakers out, so thank you so much. All right, so about half of you are advisors or consultants, about a third of you are regulators, and then it looks like about 20% are buyers or developers. So we have a really good mix. That's excellent. Okay, what do you see as the generally most challenging environmental risks for redevelopment of contaminated property? And as the responses come in, we're seeing remediation costs. I think our speakers will agree, probably not a big surprise for about more than half of you. That's it. Regulatory approval, another big concern, as well as delays and loss of profits. All right, let's go ahead and move along. How many environmentally impaired properties are you working on now? What does your portfolio look like? All right, so it looks like we're again pretty evenly spread. We've got a number of you who are working on more than 10 properties. Some of you don't have any right now, but this webinar will prepare you. And then looks like the biggest group is working on between 2 and 5. So thank you again. All right, and final question. What magnitude of remediation costs is associated with the single largest environmentally impaired properties that you're working on? Okay, so we're watching the numbers come in, and it looks like we've got about a third each in the $500,000 to $1 million range, and the $1 million to $5 million range. And then we look like we're somewhat evenly split between the 0 to 500,000 and the above 10 million range. So we're all over the map. Great to know. Thank you so much, folks. Those are, again, very helpful to our speakers in terms of moving ahead. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Brian Benn, principal and co-founder of Environmental Risk and Financial Solutions. And Brian is going to lead off with a discussion of environmental risks and cost of risk evaluation. Brian, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for sticking with us this morning. I'd like to just say why we founded our firm. We work at the intersection of environmental risks, financial and insurance, legal, regulatory, The multidisciplinary team approach is really essential to understand many environmental risk issues and their costs. And just a quick word about some of the players involved in this. Of course, we work with environmental consultants and attorneys, and that's why we'd arranged the multidisciplinary panel today. But I wanted to make a couple of additional comments. You hear a lot of people talk about risk and players in risk. For example, insurers and insurance brokers talk about risk and how they help their clients. It's important to understand that insurance brokers focus on insurable risks and are usually paid on commission for placing insurance. And that will be their focus relative to risks. Insurance companies also do detailed environmental risk assessments, but it's an internal assessment that you'll never see. And they do it for the purposes of the scope of insurance that they want to quote. So bear those in mind when you think of how to put together an independent and integrated analysis of environmental risks for transactions. And so really at the core of this is, there should be, if you can just click the next one there, you'll see that's where the cost of risk evaluation that I'm talking about really lies. And I'm going to refer to that as core as the shorthand for cost of risk evaluations. So drilling down on the environmental risk components, today's focus is on property contamination. We also do work in other areas, and clearly there's an interrelationship and overlap among these different components. Corporate liabilities, the E, at least in terms of the environmental social governance factors as they affect asset management. And we also work in the climate risk sphere, and that's an area that's growing increasingly important. But today's focus on property contamination will be what we'll focus about. The common starting questions that we see many people think about are, of course, what are the components of cost? You know, what's the schedule and how will that be affected by contamination? What are the most contentious issues or potential litigation? And of course, the regulatory approval process. So as you think of a cost of risk evaluation, today we'll quickly describe what it is, how we do it, and why our clients find it useful. This is a fairly dense slide, and I won't go through it all in great detail because the list is really quite endless. But where I'll start here is the common approach that most parties take. And on the left side, you'll see there the two main categories relative to expected remediation and other risks, focusing on, of course, the scope of work, what are the additional costs and contingencies, and if there are guarantees, what are the costs of those guarantees. With risks that fall outside of expected remediation, there may be commercial insurance. If not, there may also be solutions that can be designed in a custom way to deal with those risks. Liabilities can be transferred. Sometimes special purpose entities are set up for those. And of course, there's always some issue of counterparty financial or credit risk and collectability with those. But think of those two broad categories and keep those in mind as we go ahead and talk about what a cost of risk evaluation is for environmental risk factors. Some of the other factors there that get left out when you think of costs beyond expectations or guarantees are things like costs above a financial assurance or the guarantor's capacity. It's important to recognize, too, that even if you have an estimate for the cost of remediation and a financial assurance that is tied to that number, well, what if the actual cost is higher than that? Is the financial assurance adequate for that higher number? I mean, today, my co-presenter, Buzz Hines, and I are aware of a situation where there was a financial assurance put in place for a portfolio of properties. It was based on the estimate at the time. The operator of the sites filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The estimate then by the beneficiaries of that financial assurance was then revised by a huge number, an order of magnitude, effectively, higher. And so even though there was a financial assurance put in place, the underlying estimate was woefully inadequate. And so now there are multiple parties looking at that and dealing with the fallout from it. When you think of risk management factors as well, there can be many issues that go beyond the insurance coverage. The first place to start, of course, is what is excluded in the insurance, what excluded contaminants, what are potentially the pathways or media that might be excluded, and what types of damages, like bodily injury or property damage or particular cleanup costs, can also be excluded. I'll just point out a couple of things that might not be immediately evident or intuitive in terms of what's not covered. When you look at the last one there, known and non-disclosed conditions. That's a typical exclusion in most insurance policies. And that may sound self-evident, but it's not always clear what is actually known. One example, a client of ours had some electrical transformers on their property that were put in the 1960s. They had a maintenance report from the 1970s showing that there were some minor drips and leaks from those transformers. They were minor. They had them fixed. But years later, when they went to lease out the site and do some cleanup in relation to the redevelopment of the property, they discovered PCB contamination below the transformer pads. The insurer claimed that the drips identified in the 1970s maintenance report constituted a known condition, and that those specifically were not disclosed. Well, that clearly begs a lot of questions. What is the reasonable expectation of what's known and what should be disclosed, and what's the level of disclosure? So the cost of risk evaluation, think of it as something that looks across the risk spectrum, and it helps identify strategies that might not otherwise be apparent. And here, another quick example of where this can shine a light. We had a client who understood the importance of conducting all appropriate inquiries to avail themselves of the bona fide prospective purchaser protections, and so knew that they wanted to do a phase 1 environmental assessment along with other actions. But there was a lot of information already about the site, and our client knew that they were able to place an insurance policy at the point in time before they were going to do the new phase 1 environmental site assessment. And so the question that came up through the cost of risk evaluation was, should you wait and do the phase 1 later after placing the insurance, or do it first? And on balance, we decided that the risks of doing a new phase 1 and potentially jeopardizing the placement of the insurance were greater, and that we delayed doing the phase 1 until after the insurance was put in place. So maybe a little bit counterintuitive in terms of timing, but a quick example of how the cost of risk evaluation can help balance across the spectrum of risk components. So how do we do a cost of risk evaluation? And if you think back to the two big categories of expected remediation and other risks, this slide is really a depiction of how we try to measure the risks related to the expected remediation. Many of you are probably very familiar with cost-benefit analyses, probabilistic analyses, decision trees, building scenarios. What we do in our analysis is build a risk profile based on many of those same factors. We also look at risk pricing models that have been used over the years that look at the risks of additional costs. And so we factor those into our risk profiling. And one of the benefits that comes out of that is that we can identify by line items, major line items, what's a likely range of costs by line item, and describe why that can really help you in your negotiations as you parse through potential remediation costs. For the other risks, what this shows on the left-hand side are the major categories of risk factors. Typically, the additional risks beyond the expected remediation would include the unknown conditions, as well as maybe some known conditions that might not be actionable. And I mean actionable from a regulatory perspective, may not need to be dealt with, contamination left in place, for example. And the cost factors in the bottom left there in terms of pricing are often related to, well, what's the duration of the risk? What's going to be retained versus transferred? And on the right-hand side would be the types of damages that those risks can often result in by major categories. And so the models that we use will identify potential costs by those categories. And they're often based on a combination of both market pricing, to the extent that there is a commercial insurance market presently to transfer some of those risks, as well as the modeling for pricing those if they're not currently available in the market, based on the long history of either the commercial market or other interpolation or extrapolation of those risk factors. So why do our clients use this? We find often in negotiations that transactions fail because parties on one side or the other adopt inflexible positions, kind of take it or leave it postures on risks. Often it's the economically dominant party trying to push risks onto the other party. And so the weaker economic party can really benefit by evaluating the cost of those risks to help them, factor those costs into the transaction value, identify the ranges and boundaries of risks into contract terms, which will be something that Buzz will, I'm sure, talk about. And then component by component, think of those somewhat as negotiating chips in the negotiation. So if a seller, for example, thinks a particular risk is de minimis, really shouldn't be dealt with, and a buyer has a different perspective, suggests a cost, well, you at least have a bound on which to negotiate that, and the seller may decide, in fact, to retain a risk if, rather than offering a price concession if they truly believe it is a low risk. And since very few people like unpleasant surprises, we also find our clients like a cost of risk evaluation, if it's done early enough, to try to prevent fewer potential surprises later. And so it can often highlight major issues, can sometimes come up with costs early on, depending on the availability of data, so that once parties get into diligence and there are hard deposits at stake and it's tougher to walk away, prior to that, can have a good sense of what is likely to happen later. Here's an example of how we worked with a private developer where it's really the seller who had the economic leverage in this case. And our client was really interested in acquiring the site. The seller had done a considerable amount of remediation. Not entirely, however. The seller had installed remedial features on the site that would need to run for about 30 years and wanted our client to take on responsibility for the performance of those installed remedial features. So, of course, our client had not designed them or installed them, and the question really was, well, how would those systems perform, and what's the risk of assuming that liability? And moreover, relative to the planned redevelopment, where footings were going to be placed, how compatible would that be with those installed remedial features, and how would they affect those systems that really were designed to operate with a groundwater flow model that could have been impacted by where you would place the foundations and footings for the redevelopment. So we work on a multidisciplinary team, as I mentioned, and work closely with the environmental consultants and attorneys and go through the cost of risk evaluation. Here, of course, the first major component was, what are the contingencies relative to the system performance? And after a pretty rigorous analysis of that and the costs and looking at what might happen, we were able to push back, and the seller retained responsibility for the first 5-year plan to be submitted to the regulatory agency on the performance of the installed remedial features. That was a big win for our client to get some negotiating leverage there that way. The soil management risks were a big factor because we knew that, as well as the site had been characterized, there were undoubtedly going to be areas that would be encountered in the redevelopment that hadn't been characterized. So we knew there were hotspots out there to be managed. How we would do that was a big part of the team approach. Vapor intrusion was another huge issue because, as you know, if you have an elevator in a building, it operates like a pump that can suck soil vapor into the building. Fortunately, there's lots of good engineering controls, passive or active systems to help control and mitigate that risk. And interestingly, one of the factors that came out here was naturally occurring conditions, and those are typically excluded on environmental insurance policies. And those can occur from various things like radon gas. In this case, it was methane, which had been found at this site within the lower and upper bounds explosive limits for methane. So it was not a de minimis issue. It had to be dealt with and was not going to be insured. And so this process of going through the cost of risk evaluation did create additional confidence. So our client was able to attract more capital partners at a stage that was really very critical for them.
And Brian, if I could jump in just to hear my voice, and welcome everyone, and we're sorry for the delay, and thanks to Sarah and C-Clear for putting this together. But I think the other thing that your scenario identifies is sometimes in a situation like this where you develop greater capacity with respect to information, it also allows you to go to the regulators. And this doesn't sound like that kind of a scenario, but sometimes the regulators may be willing to discuss changes to the remedy or curtailing of certain systems. And so this kind of a risk evaluation can be very beneficial in terms of setting up a strategy or setting up a dynamic with the regulators going forward. And I know that that was, one of the things that was identified as a core issue for some of the folks on the call today, and that's delays and lost profits and all those types of things. If you have uncertainty with respect to the regulatory picture and can create some certainty, it can make for a much better transaction going forward and a better development going forward, right, if you will, as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for adding that, because we did have a lot of iterative discussions with the agency in this case as to the points of compliance on the groundwater and contingencies on the system performance, as well as the vapor intrusion. Those were the two regulatory issues in this case, and we had a lot of discussions that way. And fortunately, the agency was very flexible and understanding, had a deep technical understanding of those issues, and it was very helpful. The second example I'd like to describe where we used the cost of risk evaluation very effectively was for a public entity that was negotiating to buy a site that had been used for about 100 years as a mill site. All sorts of impacts. There were about 8,000 piles on the site. The buildings had been demolished, as you can see from this photo, at the stage that our client was negotiating to acquire this property. But lots of upland impacts. There's a small river running through the site, so there were issues of impacts to the river, restoration issues there, sediment impacts, as well as impacts to the greater harbor, and again, a regulatory concern or issues of how would the site be defined, and would it be possible to segregate the upland remediation from the in-water sediment and harbor-wide remediation and restoration issues. So the other factor that our client had on this particular site was, of course, one to spur economic development in the area and deal with local wastewater and stormwater infrastructure issues that they had in particular. So how we used the cost of risk evaluation here was primarily to demonstrate that we had a very robust diligence process. We detailed the top 30 or so major environmental risk factors, and we were able to either quantify or qualify them and created a pretty effective negotiating strategy. I mentioned the regulatory concerns and issues as to the scope and the timing, the restoration and its extent, both the riparian and the sediments and harbor-wide issues. a quick discussion about the cultural resources. That turned out to also be a very important factor in this site, because about 5 miles away, we knew that a few years prior to our client taking on this negotiation, the state Department of Transportation had purchased a property that similarly had indications of being an ancient Native American village. And the State Transportation Agency, unfortunately, had not done their homework. They went ahead and started developing the site. It was to be used as a graving dock for pouring footings for a nearby bridge in their construction. And they got into constructing the site, and after desecrating about 300 graves and spending $90 million, the State Transportation Agency ended up walking away from the site, and it was a huge fiasco. So our plan with the cultural resources was to protect them carefully and actually use that as part of the economic redevelopment, as part of a museum, and have the local tribe be quite involved in the redevelopment. And the last huge issue that we had was the area-wide impacts and potential third-party claims, because over 100 years of operation of the mill, there were concerns about dioxin impacts primarily and superficial soil contamination. So I guess I would leave you with this point that it's really critical to build the multidisciplinary team approach, and the cost of risk evaluation is one way to tie in these various risk factors through that approach. And let me just say at this point that we're sorry that our colleague Kirsten Dewey isn't able to join us today, and we wanted to quickly describe, Buzz and I will both jump in and describe what we think Kirsten wanted to describe with her slides. And I'll just start with this, making a few points here. I think what jumps out at me with this slide is that on the top line, in understanding the project, the redevelopment plan and the regulatory factors are really two critical components, and of course they're very closely related. How the property is going to be reused, how the agencies will view that, are really two factors on that top line.
Right, and I think to your point about the multidisciplinary team and what we were just talking about too, is identifying those stakeholders and then, where appropriate, involving them, and maybe creating some beneficial aspects to those stakeholders that bring them along and get them excited about the project.
Yes, yeah. I think the point I would highlight on the second line is to evaluate the uncertainties, but I would also jump then to the third line in terms of the proactive regulatory involvement is really a pretty critical phase in bringing together the plan, the regulatory factors, and as Buzz saying, how that plays in ultimately to the remedy selection, which is so important.
And I think, just to go back to that second item, identifying or removing the data gaps, that can be a frustrating process, because often you'll come into a project and you'll think, based on the regulatory history and the players involved, that it's very well defined and it's very well understood. And maybe because of a new regulator, or maybe because of a difference in project uses and deed restrictions that may be present, and having to remove those deed restrictions, more work will have to be done and things are discovered, which then, Brian, goes back to some of the points you were making about, when's the best timing to do that? Does it jeopardize insurance discussions that you may have had? So that can be a tricky item, and it can often be very frustrating. Sometimes it's driven by the regulators, but sometimes it's driven by the project proponents too.
Yeah. It's a tough question. And I think Kirsten wanted to make the point about balancing that. Mm-hmm. When do you have enough data, and what's the cost benefit of getting more data? I think the last line there is really about some of the contracting approaches. How do you deal with cost uncertainty, the amount, the timing of costs, and how do you scope out guarantees? To what extent can guarantees really be offered as the environmental contracting firm?
Right.
And
cost can be a huge driver for that. And again, those folks engage in the very same kind of analysis that, Brian, you've been talking about. And risk is a huge component of how they come up with a price. And once you see that price, you can react to it accordingly.
Right, exactly. Kirsten had two examples that we will run through, one with a guaranteed fixed price and another where you'll see the guarantee was considered, but an alternative was being pursued. In the example with the guarantee, this is a fairly interesting situation, a not uncommon situation of a large chlorinated solvent plume in groundwater impacting a drinking water source, a problem known for a long time, multi-parties, high profile. There had been, in fact, a prior guarantee that we understand failed, and the revised approach was able to provide a new guarantee and a new technical approach to satisfy the parties. And it combined a strong technical strategy, mainly focused on vapor intrusion, but also with some guarantees, limited guarantees, but nevertheless guarantees on price. I'm sure that if you have questions about these examples and want to email us or follow up with Kirsten, I'm sure she can provide more color on those. Mm-hmm. So as mentioned, there was a strategy to cap the parties' costs and to focus on vapor intrusion costs in this example. And the next example that she had, I think, is also quite interesting because there was an iterative process here of remedy selection and technical response plan. Initially, Apex had proposed a guaranteed fixed price remediation project. And this was a former refinery that a redevelopment was proposed for, is being proposed for. And as it turns out, the cost of the guaranteed approach just seemed to be too expensive in terms of guaranteeing the cost to close. And so the approach that Apex took was to be creative in looking at, well, what can be done with the existing resources? How far can we get? And so a fixed pricing for the upfront costs of the remedial infrastructure installation became the solution here, to focus resources there, to allow potentially the development of resources from a reuse to fund further work. And I think this is a really good example of creative long-term thinking. How do you get to a good end result if there's a barrier of limited resources up front? We can't always do exactly what we want as quickly as we want. And how can we come up with creative solutions to balance the remedial approach, the redevelopment, and hopefully a flexible regulatory understanding.
Right, and sometimes segmenting, the different aspects of the project and coming up with what was done here, which is fixing the price for certain aspects of it on the front end. It can be very helpful.
Yeah.
And not trying to do the whole thing.
That's right.
But coming back to that at a later point in time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe looking at components. And so Kirsten's takeaways here are really, the balanced data gap approach, the upfront regulatory collaboration being so critical, and really leads into the issues of the development plan, the approvals, and the economic issues and finding that right approach. So I think, as we think of the regulatory and legal issues that then arise, the contracting approach, Buzz Hines is going to talk about, how he deals with a lot of those issues and how we work together on these cost of risk evaluations.
Sure, thank you. So I'll be a little more, I think, qualitative versus quantitative. Because lawyers always come at these things, I think, with more of a look and feel to them rather than crunching all the costs. And that's why, as Brian points out, it can be so critical to have the right team and to assemble the right professionals to assist you in, basically proceeding with what you want to do. So the acquisition objective is very similar to what I think was on the previous slide in terms of understanding your project. And this can take on many different forms. It can take on the form of how the transaction should be structured. It can take on the form of really more elemental in what the land use considerations are. And I think going back to some of the discussion we've had already, it can also involve identifying properties that might have historic characteristics that can really slow down your land use and entitlement processes, or where there's cultural issues, tribal issues, those types of things. We've talked about identifying and assessing environmental risks, and that's done in a variety of different ways. It's done in the way that Brian has just identified. It's done on a technical basis with consultants like Kirsten and her group. And then, once you get through those issues, drafting provisions essential to contaminated property contracts. I mean, how do you set this up to be protective of your rights and interests and allow you to proceed? And then really that last piece is really related to that in terms of mitigating and managing environmental risks. There we go. So we'll just do some quick pictures. This is San Francisco, the city of, county of, and this is a very large area that was just referred to as Mission Bay, Bayview, Hunters Point, Candlestick Point developments. And this is just an interesting sort of scenario to identify because it's a multiple stakeholder, many different kinds of land uses, and it's really been done over a vast period of time. So you have ballpark interests, biotech, and a variety of other things going on there, residential uses, commercial use, and so on and so forth. I think I keep pressing the wrong button. There we go. The developer Lennar, this is a photograph from the their website basically, and this is what the Hunters Point Bayview area will look like down the road. And this is a fascinating site because Hunters Point was a fabled former naval shipyard, so that's going through investigative and remedial activities. There's an area called Yosemite Slough that has sediment issues involving contaminants such as PCBs and lead that a number of parties are engaged with EPA in working on. Candlestick Park was demolished, as some folks from the Bay Area or who have been to the Bay Area will know, and that area is going to be developed into residential housing and such. So a lot of stuff going on there and a lot of interest in play. Cleanups across the country as well. We just wanted to, highlight some other projects in a variety of different areas, including Denver, South Carolina, Binghamton, New York. And I think the thing that's important about looking at these particular slides is that these projects that we talk about, they have a number of different uses, and those uses will often drive how the investigation takes place and will often drive the risk analysis as well. And I think also a point I want to make about this is that there's also opportunities with respect to different kinds of projects to really engage the regulators. And I bring this up because, definitely in the affordable housing context, I have never been greeted so warmly by officials at regulatory bodies, including state officials, local officials, and federal officials, than when you're working on something that really is going to be a benefit to the community, that regulatory staff may know people who live there or may have family that live there. And when you can do a brownfields project that really has the beneficial aspects associated with providing that kind of affordable housing stock that is in such great need throughout the country, you can really move some of these projects forward in a much more cohesive and quick fashion. So I'll just run through quickly a lot of these slides because I think a lot of these are really self-evident, and I've tried to create a slide deck that folks can look back to for references. And as Brian said, all of us are available for email questions as they might arise. So, just real quickly in terms of acquisition objectives, you want to minimize your exposure to environmental risks. That's why we're here. That's why you folks are engaged in the work that you are. From a developer and a project proponent perspective, you want to protect your return on investment, and that return on investment may be different based on who the developer is. If it's low income, affordable housing, if it's got commercial development, if you're tied in with a city or county, if you're tied into a transportation-oriented development. And then you're always wanting to look at, what the future is going to hold. So we've been talking about a lot of these issues, so I won't spend a lot of time. This is really just kind of a recap of the different kinds of cost drivers that can be encountered. And as we've been talking about, some of these are known as you enter into a project, and some of these become known as you engage in a phase 1 process or a phase 1+ process or a phase 2 if the situation calls for it. The key thing from my presentation that I want you to take away from is that there are defenses and things that you can do legally to protect yourself from the parade of horribles associated with environmental liabilities. And the Superfund liability statute has written into it and has codified, and many state statutes follow this as well, certain protections to innocent landowners, to bona fide prospective purchasers, which can involve both landowners and lessees, to contiguous property owners, and then often secured creditors, lenders. So with respect to that last point, I'm sure many folks are familiar with situations where, for example, in the 08-09 recession, a lot of entities were not able to proceed, but there was a secured creditor, and many of those secured creditors did not take possession or title to the property, but worked with the regulators and did so with the protections that are afforded under the statute. And these are not complete defenses, but they certainly do protect you in the context of future liability. And again, just to kind of, highlight some of these things, there's obligations and requirements associated with attaining the status associated with innocent landowner, bona fide prospective purchaser, contiguous property owner. And I think really just sort of an overarching way to look at these issues is, I think many people are familiar with principles of due care, as I call them. Those are basic tort principles. They involve foreseeability, what you kind of owe your neighbor, what the community expects of you. And so a lot of these are very common sense. They're obviously codified and you have to follow the requirements, and those requirements are set forth, and usually, you go through a checklist. But never lose sight of the fact that sometimes you just need to take a step back and look at these things somewhat intuitively and really kind of understand from the perspective of due care, what is it that I need to do? And that's sometimes, to borrow a line, that's the right thing. But other times it will be a lot more almost confused around the fringes, and that's where I think working with these different disciplines, looking at some of the different products you can get to protect those risks as well is very important. So there's a lot of compliance issues associated with meeting these requirements, and at the end of the day, you do attain that status. Brian has hit on a number of these too, but just to run through them quickly, when you're looking at different projects and properties and moving forward with acquisitions and sort of setting these things up for future development, there's a number of environmental risks that you want to be aware of. The tort liability should never be minimized, and that's really a collection of folks that might be exposed to things on your site. And maybe some of these are prior exposures, and maybe some of them are future exposures, and you can deal with some of the future exposures as you get down some of these lists by setting up deed restrictions, land use covenants, things of that sort. Some of the other environmental risks, it just involves looking at the value of the property. I think, as all of us know, with contamination comes certain reductions in the value of property. I think what we're seeing now in many marketplaces across the country, especially with respect to the technology booms and such, is that while I will not say that those issues, that people lose sight of them, I think people are willing to move forward much more willingly than perhaps has been the case in the past. Natural resources damages can be a huge issue in terms of sediment issues and some of the other things that are going on. And then, the other thing, just from a large acquisition standpoint, you might be acquiring a site or acquiring entities that have liability associated with where they sent waste. The great thing about Superfund is it's a statute that never stops giving. And we know from, our own experience and our clients' experience that sometimes they might be called upon to remediate a site not once, not twice, but several times. So we've kind of talked about this, and again, this provides more detail in terms of what the all-appropriate inquiry compliance measures require, and some of this involves the hiring of professionals and the satisfaction of the environmental professional qualification prong under CERCLA. Some of this also involves who's acceptable to investors, lenders, who's retaining. Is it the buyer or the seller? And there's a number of issues sometimes associated with that from the standpoint of disclosure. And sometimes those understandings can be reached ahead of time, and sometimes they get dealt with later. And then in terms of kind of moving quickly into how do you deal with some of these things from a contractual perspective. We've talked a little bit around the edges of the due diligence process, but I think everything we're talking about from the risk perspective really enters into conducting environmental due diligence. Most of the things you do from a due diligence perspective really feed into the risk analysis. And sometimes they feed in later. Sometimes they feed in right away because you know of them. There's environmental disclosures. I think for anybody who's worked in kind of a large transaction, you've seen data rooms, and that has obviously been transformed over the years that we've all been practicing, where instead of dealing with large boxes of documents in very dusty warehouses, it's all online. And so the disclosures are very important, but a lot of that also involves asking the right questions, having the right professionals involved. Insurance professionals look at disclosures in a different way than others will. And then reps and warranties. What can you get from the other side if you're buying the property, and what, as a seller, are you willing to give in a property disposition? And sometimes you're not willing to give anything, and it's as is, whereas, and the burdens are completely on the buyer. And sometimes the circumstances are such that that's perfectly acceptable, and people will move forward with that. And other times there's going to be negotiations involved and decisions involved too as to whether or not it really does make sense to proceed. So there's environmental indemnities that are very common and can provide coverage, and sometimes those are phased indemnities, as Brian identified. They may only last for a set period of time and then may end. Sometimes they'll be permanent, depending upon the circumstances. Releases and covenants, how extensive might those be? Sometimes they can be absolutely complete, and in California we have something called the 1542 release, which releases future claims, and other states have those as well. And you do not want to do that unless you are very certain of the circumstances associated with the transaction. Other times there's guarantees and cost sharing. You may be involved where the seller, or the buyer for that matter, is a limited purpose LLC, and maybe that's not sufficient for some of the players that are involved, and there need to be more extensive guarantees to members of the LLCs or something along those lines. And you want to be careful how you do that, because in all of these situations you've got the environmental regulators to be aware of, and you may have set up a single entity and single purpose LLC for the very purpose of limiting your liability, and you want to be very careful not to do something along the line that might jeopardize that.
Right, and the only value in a separate entity, it's always related to the financial performance.
Exactly.
What is that assurance? What is the mechanism, and how strong is it?
Right, and this last bullet point just hits on something that Brian talked about at the outset too, which is the investigative and remedial commitments. You'll sometimes come into a site that's very well defined. It's in operation and maintenance mode. There's a groundwater system that's operating. There's vapor systems that are operating, or maybe vapor systems have to be installed upon, the project being constructed, and, who has those commitments? And sometimes the seller wants to retain those. We have many corporate clients that really don't want to turn those things over because they want to have the control. They want to have the certainty associated with it. They don't want to get into a situation where there's a third-party claim because somebody didn't do something that could have been an obligation that they would have performed. Mm-hmm. And so those things can sometimes be retained and dealt with in that fashion. These are just kind of another list of things that really we've talked about in terms of mitigating and managing environmental risks. Statutory defenses that are available, regulatory actions. Let's just take a moment and focus on this for a second, because this is an important issue state to state to state, and each state and each locality may have different mechanisms by which you can gain certainty and maybe even end certain regulatory activities with respect to different types of media and different types of regulatory approaches. So you might be able to have a soil closure in advance of a groundwater closure. You might be able to curtail your groundwater system operating and get, limited groundwater closure while still having to deal with soil issues. And to the extent that the regulatory entities are maybe not involved, how do you get them involved? And you can do that on a state-by-state level through applying for, voluntary action and getting a particular entity to help you and to gain some of these regulatory closures. And there's decisions involved associated with who you want to get. Is it the local agency? Is it a state agency? Is it US EPA in one of the regions? Is it some combination? In California, we have something called AB 2061, where you can apply to Cal EPA for a lead agency, which then gives you sort of super protections upon closure, but that's not for every site. And sometimes you want to work with the local entities, and sometimes maybe the local entities don't have the proper skills or the availability of a risk assessor or something like that. So lots of issues to sort of consider as you go through that. On-site issues that you're encountering when you're actually doing the development, those are very important. And then the institutional and engineering controls. Oftentimes, an entity that's selling property wants to leave a deed restriction in place. We have situations now where land in the South Bay area is at such a premium, and different uses are now desired for some of those properties, where we are actually, on behalf of some of our clients who have been engaged in remedial activities, going back to the regulatory agencies to reduce and relax some of the restrictions on use. And we're doing that in conjunction with the project proponents who, for example, in East Palo Alto, might want to put a school on a site that's been contaminated. And so there's a host of issues associated with that. Brian talked about environmental insurance. That can be a key component too. And sometimes that's available for a variety of areas, and sometimes it's very limited. So last slide, and then we can kind of wrap up, is just some different sites that may provide resources. And the US EPA brownfield site is identified here, and CClear, with respect to the areas of the country in which it operates, is a huge resource, and there's funding available through that resource in some different mechanisms. And then we've also just identified some different state links as well for folks to look at by way of sort of interest and introduction as well. So I'll close with that.
Wonderful.
I'm sorry to go through that all so quickly.
Oh, well, thank you so much to both of you, Buzz and Brian. I want to share your contact information on this next slide. Again, this will be emailed to all of the attendees. It'll also be available on CClear's blog and website, but please do reach out. As Buzz and Brian both said, you can also reach out to CClear. We'll move to questions in just a second, but I do want to say that the sequel to this week's webinar will happen next week. June 21st, we'll be talking about developer math. So we've talked about risk, we've talked about effectively risk and reward. So come hear from developers about how it all gets put together. And then finally, we want to just remind everyone that the National Brownfields Conference is coming up in Pittsburgh in early December. So you can enter your questions into the box that you should be seeing in the upper right-hand side of your screen. I'm going to lead off with a question for both Buzz and Brian. So I get the sense from listening to both of you speak that the tools and techniques that you've discussed are very commonly used by private sector actors, corporations, individual private developers. And I get the sense that maybe these aren't as heavily used in the public sector. Would love to hear your comments on that, and also if there's one thing that you'd like for our attendees in the public sector to take away from this presentation, what would that be?
Well, I'll start, and I think they are used in the public sector in a variety of different ways. In certain states, I know California, as a chief example, we used to have redevelopment agencies, and those redevelopment agencies have gone away to be replaced somewhat by planning staff and stuff. But I think with respect to public projects, these same kinds of issues are very prevalent because public entities can be held responsible under the law as well. And so a lot of the things that we've been talking about, I think, are very applicable to public projects. And sometimes those public projects will have a private component too. We're seeing a lot more of that in terms of big infrastructure projects, or even co-teaming to create affordable housing in different communities where the city or county needs to be very much involved because they have the property and they have the land use approvals. And so I think these issues are very much in play as well.
Yeah, I would agree. And I just guess I would add that, yes, I do see public entities sometimes avail themselves of these tools. I think there's a common thread. Sometimes both private and public entities will look and say, is it worth investing in the upfront kind of evaluation that will ultimately help me? And finding those resources can really be a great investment. But it can also be difficult for them to find those funds. And I've seen many examples of those where, city negotiating with a developer on a affordable housing development where there's contamination, the developer comes back to the city, says, well, I have to change the terms of our agreement now. Is that public entity going to get their own resources to do an independent evaluation of those risks and alternatives at that juncture?
Right.
And in many cases, I would say they opt not to because there's a cash outlay to do that.
Right. And they'll suggest perhaps that they're relying upon what's been created, but you really can't. I mean, to the extent that a consultant has done a study for the project proponent, the city can't rely on that.
That's right.
But they may still use it, and it may help them make a decision.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Can we talk a little bit about institutional controls as well? And I think that these sort of came up at various points in the discussion, but I just want to dig in a little bit more. How much do the risk assessment methodologies and tools that you were discussing rely on viable institutional controls like registries or deed restrictions?
Well, from my perspective, it's often a very big component of projects, a reality that there will be some sort of land use restriction, some sort of a covenant. The question partly becomes, well, what is the future use? How is that going to be managed? What's the potential for violating some future land use control? Usually unintentionally. Rarely would it be intentionally violated, but yeah, so it becomes, I think, from my perspective, looking at risk, how effectively can the parties manage that risk? It really is a manageable risk, but not easy to manage, and as time goes on, probably more and more difficult to continue to manage it.
Okay, great. We have a question from an attendee. This comes from Kathy. And so Kathy notes that she didn't see any reference in the PowerPoint to lead as a brownfield contaminant. Knowing it's on most old buildings, how does that factor into some of these risk assessments that you see in working with your clients?
Well, I mean, it's a definite factor. And as I mentioned, with respect to sediment cleanups, for example, you see a lot of lead-driven sediment cleanups along with PCBs and things like that, because lead is a contaminant that you often see in combined sewer overflows and such things. It's also very prevalent in building issues, and I can't emphasize enough how dangerous it is. I mean, we see that in the context of the Flint debacle, if you will, with respect to people being exposed at very high levels to lead, and that's just it's a public health concern. And you can have that same issue with respect to older buildings that may have lead paint associated with them. And so it can be a key remedial component, and I think it can be a key risk driver. And I think I'm glad Kathy asked this question, because I think lead is almost emblematic of the things that we've identified in terms of risks. I mean, you've got third-party suits that you need to be aware of. You have, property damage suits that you need to be aware of. And this can come up in the acquisition context, and it can also come up as you're, considering development or redevelopment of a particular area or space. So it's a key driver, I think, in everything that we do in terms of the risk analysis.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think it's a great question. I would also include asbestos-containing materials in perhaps the same category. And one line of distinction that you might want to keep in mind with regard to potential risk transfer is that lead-based paint, lead itself, and asbestos-containing materials in media of soil or groundwater can be often a risk that's transferable to the commercial insurance markets when they're in buildings, and it's an abatement cost. It's more part of an expected abatement. I would put it more in the category of expected remediation, and I would deal with the costs more in that category of looking at the contingencies and uncertainties about the abatement related to lead. Right,
and the discussion reminds me too, don't forget about mold, both in existing buildings and then where there are rehabilitation of existing buildings. Those buildings are often open, and we've seen circumstances where mold issues will arise during the construction process and have to be dealt with. And that creates disclosure issues and a number of other things. So those can be critical in terms of your considerations.
I'm so glad that you both brought up these issues of lead and asbestos, because I think that they show up in many of the projects on which we end up working with communities. And it's often, I think there are a lot of questions about how do you deal with the funding, especially because many of these communities will go on to apply for EPA grants. And there might be a building where the environmental concerns are dominated by lead and asbestos, and there's always a question of how do we present that, right? Especially if maybe next door we have another property that's also going to be in need of funds, but that might have PCBs or some other kind of contaminant. So it's good to hear across the spectrum about those. I'm going to throw out one more question, and again encourage our audience to list yours, but changes in land use, changes in zoning, changes in regulatory standards. I mean, these are all things that I think we see come up in some of the projects on which we've worked. Can you talk a little bit, Buzz and Brian, about how a cost of risk evaluation factors into changes like that, external changes?
Well, I think sometimes it drives my clients crazy. But it also creates opportunities. And I can just give one kind of quick example of that. And here in the Bay Area, transportation-oriented development gets identified. Well, it's in an area where there was lots of industrial operation. And so through that transportation-oriented development land use proposal, if you will, the designated land uses and the zoning changes across the board. And so I might have a client that's engaged in remedial activities, but they're not at all towards the end of those remedial activities. And then all of a sudden they're faced with the prospect of people living in an area that was highly contaminated, was industrial, was designed for industrial use. And I think it creates a whole new way of thinking for some of those corporate entities. And I bring up the possibility and the example of opportunities being presented because oftentimes what will occur in that situation is it drives a faster cleanup. It drives a data gaps analysis or something along those lines so that the corporate entity can both clean up the property to reduce the risk or eliminate the risk, but maybe also participate in the enhanced land use values in a sale of the property.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us this afternoon, and thank you so much to our audience for sticking with us. Again, we apologize for the unexpected technical difficulties at the beginning, but we are so glad that we were able to have this conversation today. We think that this topic is incredibly important, and thank you very much to Buzz and Brian for being so generous with your time and with your expertise. So we will be back next week with another webinar. Stay tuned, and again, we will be sending out the materials, including this really information-rich PowerPoint to all of the attendees. And be in touch. Thanks very much, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.